Hi everyone, welcome back to Tech Booth. Today we are looking at using your phone to create content. Back when I started video production, for you to be able to do any good quality work, you needed very expensive equipment and a lot of it. But with the advances in technology these days, all you need is a good smartphone. Consider investing in something to stabilize your video, a tripod to put your smartphone on. If you are shooting vlog style with your phone and you're moving around, then consider investing in some kind of stabilizer like a gimbal for your phone that gives you very smooth movements when you're shooting yourself or even shooting a B-roll for your program. Audio is a really important part of your production. People will forgive bad video. They will continue watching your content if the audio is good. So you need to invest in a good microphone for you to get the best audio that you can afford. There are two types of microphone that you can use. One is the shotgun microphone. These are microphones that you can add to the top of your camera. The thing about the shotgun microphone though is that you will need then to buy an accessory like a cage. A cage is something that you put around your camera so that you can attach accessories around it. And so if you're going to go with the shotgun microphone, you must also consider buying a cage for your smartphone so that you can attach that microphone on top and capture better audio. The other is the lavalier microphone that you clip onto your clothes. It can get very good audio because of proximity, and so the closer you are to the microphone, the better the audio, but there is a limit. If you get that microphone too close to you, then you also start getting a problem with what we call plosives. Now these are sounds in speech that make the p sound like P's and B's, and you make those sounds by blowing out air. And so if your microphone is too close, as I've seen a lot of people, sometimes they put the microphone right up to their mouth, and when they get to those sounds, the P's and the B's, or the plosives as we call them, then you hear that very harsh blowing sound into the microphone. You can get a windshield that you can put on your microphone, and that will take care of some of those plosives, and you get better quality sound. And you'll need good earphones or headphones for you to be able to listen to what you are recording to make sure that the sound is great. Something else that you need to invest in is lighting, especially if you're going to be shooting indoors. If you're just starting off, then just use natural light as much as possible. Sitting next to a large window that lets light in provides a very good soft light. One form of light that's really popular is the ring light. It is inexpensive, very easy to set up, and provides good quality soft light. The only downside of the ring light that I've seen with some people is the reflection that it gives, especially if you are wearing glasses, can be a bit distracting. You can see the ring in the glasses, and if you don't wear glasses, you can see the ring in the pupil of the eyes of the person who it is lighting. So for some people that's distracting, and they really don't like that look of that ring reflecting in the eyes. So you can invest in other inexpensive lights. The other way you can get around the whole reflection issue is just by how you place your light. Just move your light up and make sure your phone is a bit lower so you're not looking up directly into the light, and that takes that reflection out of your eyes and off your glasses. If you find it distracting, for some people it's not a big deal, but invest in good lighting for the best image. You may need to invest in a background if you're going to shoot against a background, or you can just use the natural setting that you have to shoot against. It's also recommended that you don't record stuff on your phone because it slows your phone down. So invest in good SD cards, large capacity micro SD cards. The internal memory is getting bigger and bigger on smartphones, but even the 128 gigabytes that you get on some smartphones fills up really quickly when you do a lot of productions using your phone. Next thing you want to consider is how you're going to edit your videos if you're going to do that yourself. You'll need a software to be able to edit your footage, and this can be free software that you can use on your phone, or you can even get a paid software on your phone or on a PC or any computer. And maybe when you're starting off, you can use free apps to just get yourself acquainted to editing and what it takes and how to do it. And then as you get more advanced, you can invest in the paid more advanced editing apps for your phone and also for your computer. Another consideration in the post-production work when you're editing is background music. Be careful about copyright issues. There are sites that you can go to get copyright-free background music. One of those is actually YouTube, and if you're going to be posting your stuff on YouTube, then that's a sure way of making sure you don't get any copyright issues by just getting music of YouTube itself in the audio library. The other way to make sure you don't get into any issues with background music is to buy the music and get a license. I would recommend that if you go that route, make sure you always keep your documentation, because there are people out there, especially on YouTube, who make false copyright claims, and sometimes you have to prove that you actually own the rights to that music. The first tip I would give you is get a nice lint-free cleaning cloth for your lens, so that before you start shooting, every time you make sure your lens is clean. Second tip I'd like to give you is avoid using the zoom feature on your phone. So with digital zoom, whenever you zoom in, you tend to degrade the picture and it doesn't look so good. So avoid as much as possible zooming in when you are shooting with your smartphone. Another tip, if you are shooting in natural conditions, avoid shooting with the sun in the background. Avoid shooting with huge windows that are very bright in the background, because in auto mode especially, the camera would adjust the light so that the background is well exposed, but then what happens is that the foreground or the image or the main subject that you are looking at becomes silhouetted or dark. Unless you have powerful lights that can match the brightness in the background, you are not going to get a very good image. So whenever you're shooting, make sure you are either in the shade if you're outside and your background is not too bright. The next tip I would like to give you is about the camera app that you're going to use. So your camera comes with its own app, but I would recommend that you look into getting a third-party camera app. The camera app that comes with your phone usually is very basic, especially if you are looking at the low to mid-end smartphones, and that camera app makes all the adjustments for you. So everything is automatic when you are shooting, and that can be a problem in certain situations. So I recommend that you look at camera apps that you can get on the Play Store or the App Store that you can install on your phone, so that you get more control when you are shooting. You get all the other professional features that you get on a real camera, like adjusting your iris or your aperture, adjusting your shutter speed, adjusting your ISO. All these go to making a better quality video when you can control them yourself instead of letting the camera make the decisions for you. On some phone cameras, you can switch from the auto mode, that is the default, to the pro mode. Like on some Samsung phones, you can do that, and that gives you the manual controls that I was talking about that you get with third-party camera apps. Another tip that I would like to give you is the use of wide angle on your smartphone app. As much as possible, avoid using the wide angle mode on your smartphone. Now what that does is it takes in a lot more of your scene. So if there are two people in the scene, you're able to get them in the shot, in the frame, when you're in wide angle mode. But the problem with wide angle mode is you will find that there's distortion, especially towards the edges of your frame, and they can also distort your face when you are close to it. So if you want a more natural looking shot, if you don't want distortion in your frame, then try and avoid using the wide angle lens unless you really have to. So just use the normal mode. Another tip for you, the front-facing camera or the selfie camera, the one that you use to shoot yourself, on a lot of smartphones is slightly less quality than the rear camera. You're likely to get better footage if you're using the back-facing camera than the front-facing one or the selfie camera. But this is now a bit tricky, because for you to be able to shoot, if you're shooting on your own, then you have no alternative but you use the front facing camera or the selfie camera so that you can see what you're shooting and you can frame it properly. But if you have someone that can help you to shoot, then I'd advise that you use the back facing camera, because on a lot of smartphones that camera has a better lens than the selfie one. Another tip is, as you shoot your videos, consider shooting B-roll. B-roll is the extra footage that you will use, like what I'm using in this video right now. Whenever I'm talking about something and I show that on the screen and you just hear my voice, that is called B-roll. So whenever you're planning your videos, to make them more interesting, consider what kind of B-roll can be used in your production, and it will make the video much more interesting than just watching someone talk throughout the whole video. Let's look at some of the basic video settings that you need to be familiar with if you're going to get the best video out of your phone. If you are in the manual mode, there are three very important things that you need to understand that you will be adjusting. First of all, something called the aperture, and this is how much light is let in through your lens. So the bigger the aperture, the more light goes into your camera lens. The numbers can be a bit confusing because they are fractions. So if you do have a camera app that lets you adjust the aperture, just know that the smaller the number, so if you see something like 2.8, that means more light is going into your lens. And the bigger the number, so if you have something like f16, then that means less light is going into the lens and the image will be darker. Now there are other reasons why you would choose an aperture of 2.8 versus one of 16. One of those reasons is if you want your background, as you can see my background there is a bit blurry. If you want that blurry background, then you need to use the wider apertures, so the smaller number gives you that blurry background look. But if you want everything in your frame to be in focus, then you need to use the bigger number or the smaller aperture. The other setting that you need to decide on is what frame rate you're going to be shooting at. Think of video as a series of still images that are taken one after the other. Now the frame rate is how many of those still images are taken per second. So it actually denoted as FPS, or frames per second. The standard frame rate for film production is 24 frames per second. So if your phone gives you that option to be able to adjust your frame rate, I would recommend that you use 24 frames per second as your frame rate. Now, with most basic apps, you might not even be able to adjust that frame rate, so you would not need to worry about it. But if you can adjust it, 24 frames per second is what is recommended. There are two other popular frame rates, that is 30 frames per second and 25 frames per second. And your phone might be set to one of those and you might not be able to change that. So you don't need to worry about it. But if you have a professional mode on your camera, or you have downloaded apps that allow you to change your frame rate, then you'll get those options of different frame rates. Simply stated, the more frames you have per second, the smoother your video is going to be. But 24 frames per second is kind of the agreed standard in film industry. Now, if you're going to do anything in slow motion, or you're going to slow your video down later in post-production, then you need to choose higher frame rates. And so you get frame rates like 50 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and even higher. And those will allow you to get smooth slow motion if you are going to be using that in your video. Another setting that is related to frame rate is your shutter speed. In still photography, your shutter speed is the length of time that your aperture or iris is open to expose the sensor and take the photo. And so if your shutter is open for longer, then more light goes into the lens and your image will be brighter. In the case of video, because there are multiple still images, you can think of your shutter speed as the length of time that each of those frames that is being taken is exposed to light. So in the same way, the more time the frame is exposed to light, the brighter the image is going to be. Shutter speed also affects things like motion, and so the longer the shutter speed, the smoother the motion, and you get more of a motion blur as the frames transition from one frame to another, so it looks more natural to the eye. When you increase your shutter speed, you start getting a more stuttered kind of look to your image. The standard recommendation for shutter speed is based on what is called the 180-degree rule. We won't go into that for now, but all it says is your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate, or as close to double as possible. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/60th of a second. This relationship between your shutter speed and your frame rate makes sure that you get the correct motion blur when subjects are moving in your frame and the motion looks natural. So if you are mostly shooting still objects or slow moving objects or talking heads like what I'm doing now, you don't really have to worry so much about the 180-degree rule. A lot of basic phone apps will not have an iris setting or an aperture setting, and you can use your shutter speed to adjust your exposure until you get the right exposure, not worrying so much about its relationship to frame rate. The third thing that you need to understand is called the ISO. And ISO is basically the sensitivity of the sensor in your phone that receives the light to that light. So the more sensitive your sensor is, the brighter your image is going to look. The bigger the number, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. General recommendation is that you keep your ISO as low as possible, because as you increase your ISO, you also increase the noise that is present in your image. So use ISO as a last resort to brighten up your image if you are shooting in low light conditions, but otherwise just keep that figure as low as you can. The other thing you need to decide on is your framing and your orientation. Framing refers to where your subject is in the frame. So if you're shooting an interview or you're shooting yourself like I am doing now, you want to decide where you want to place that image. Those who have trained in photography or video production will know about something called the rule of thirds. This is where you divide your screen using imaginary lines into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, and you place your subject on one of those lines in the frame. So if you're doing an interview, for example, you would place your subject on one side of the frame, and they'll be facing the side of the frame that has the other 2/3 that is empty. Now when you place your subject on one side of the frame, you can either leave the other side of the frame empty or make sure that it is being filled in the background by something that is not too distracting. And you also want to make sure that you leave enough space above the subject so that you're not cutting off the top of the head of the subject, and that is called leaving headroom. Now if you're shooting something where you are talking directly to the camera, you can use that rule, but you can also place the subject dead center in the frame because they are looking straight ahead like I'm doing now. The other thing you need to consider is your orientation. Now orientation refers to whether you are shooting in landscape mode or you're shooting in portrait mode. Now this is important because different platforms require different types of videos. On TikTok, for example, vertical video does better than the standard horizontal video. So if you're shooting for TikTok, then you need to consider shooting in vertical mode. If you're shooting for Instagram, you want square video. And if you're shooting for YouTube Shorts, that's also vertical video. But regular YouTube requires you to shoot in the horizontal or landscape mode. Now a lot of people now are on all those platforms, and you have to decide on how you're going to shoot so that when you reframe your videos for the different platforms, your video still looks good. And one tip I can give you for that is if your phone is capable of shooting 4K, then use that 4K mode because it gives you a bigger frame to work with. And secondly, try and center everything when you're shooting so that whether it's square, vertical or horizontal, it still looks good and it's still in the frame. The other thing you want to consider when setting your settings on your camera app is your video resolution. Resolution refers to the amount of detail that is recorded in your video, and that detail is measured in terms of pixels. Think of pixels as small little squares that are put together to make the image that you see. So each little pixel in your image is part of the image, and when we put those pixels together, you get the full image and the full color. So the more pixels you have in an image, the more detail, the more clarity you have in that image. So a bigger number in terms of resolution refers to more detail and more clarity and a higher resolution. So as you choose your resolution on your phone, the general rule is the higher the better, but the downside of choosing 4K, for example, over the standard HD like 1080 is that you're going to use a lot more space on your SD card to record 4K video. And secondly, for most purposes, you're going to be viewing that video at a resolution of 1080. By that I mean most screens that people have, if they're watching video on YouTube or any other platform, is only going to show you a maximum of 1080 in terms of resolution. So sometimes it's not very useful to record at 4K if you're just going to be viewing the video at 1080. And most people won't even be able to tell the difference between the two in terms of resolution when they are watching it on their screens. I would recommend that if you have the space, record at the higher resolution like a 4K, and then you can downsample it when you are now exporting or when you are editing it in your editing program. If you are going to reframe your video so that it fits different platforms, the more resolution that you have, the more flexibility you have in terms of changing that aspect ratio to fit the different formats. There you go, a few tips and tricks for making good quality content using your smartphone. Don't wait until you get an expensive camera. Start with what you have, start making the content, and learn as you go. Well, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, comments, put them down below. In the meantime, see you next time on Tech Booth.